What should phonics for nursery look like? And is phase 1 phonics still okay to teach? If you're wondering what kind of phonics should be taught in nursery or what a replacement for phase 1 phonics in nursery settings should look like, then you've come to the right place. If you're new to teaching nursery phonics or just wondering what the recent changes to phonics learning mean for teaching nursery, then this is the video for you. By the end of this video, you'll know what phonics for nursery should look like and why it's so important for our preschoolers not to rush ahead into formal phonics too quickly. The first thing we need to remember when we're teaching children to read, or those pre-reading skills when we're in nursery or preschool, is that getting children ready for phonics or teaching phonics for children learning to read, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's a long-term process. It's something which takes a long time. And if we were wanting as adults to go and learn to run a marathon, and we'd never run a marathon before, we wouldn't start by running a marathon. We'd start with a really basic training program that would take us step by step through a process, so we'd get a little bit stronger every day, a little bit more physically fit, our mental attitude would improve. And if we're thinking about learning to read, we need to think about it a little bit like that. We need to think about the fact that what we're going to be doing is preparing children step by step, one thing at a time, building on what they can already do and helping to build their feeling of that they can actually read. If we try and push them too hard, too quickly, it's going to feel overwhelming. And we've got to know all of those component parts. So if you're a marathon runner, you know that your diet is important, that your mental attitude is important, that your physical well-being is your strength, your endurance, all of those pieces are in place. When you're learning to read, you've also got to have that mental attitude. You've also got to have that resilience. You've got to be able to have really good visual memory, visual discrimination, hear sounds in words, say sounds. There's lots and lots of things to it. So when we're learning to read, what we've got to do so that it doesn't become overwhelming, in the same way that if somebody told me to run a marathon tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to just go and do it. We've got to be able to break it down into small parts. And some of us will remember this as phase 1 phonics or pre-phonics. And we're going to think about what that means today and what current thinking about that is. And really what we've got to remember is that preparing for phonics, when we're helping children to get ready to say B for B and D for D and Q for Q and for P, they all look very similar, don't they? If you're a child that's got poor visual discrimination, if you can't really tell the difference between those shapes, they all look like a circle and a stick. And their sounds are quite similar and they're very abstract. They need to be able to hear the sounds in words, they need to be able to say the sounds in words, and they need to be able to be really good at seeing different shapes and remembering those different shapes. So there's lots of things that they need to be able to do before they even get to this stage. And remember, children now in England are tasked with learning phonics from the beginning of reception, and all children start day 1 learning these letter sound correspondences. If we start this too early and miss some of these pre-phonic things that I'm going to talk about, then it's not going to help them to be able to discriminate between these shapes or even remember them. So we've got to be really clear about what our role as preschool practitioners might be. Now, this gives us a bit of a roadmap. It gives us some ideas about what we might want to think about. So here's the starting line over this side, and here's the finish line. So if this is our marathon, we've got a good idea about where we're starting and where we need to end up. When we start with our 2 and 3-year-olds, we're probably thinking of them being able to talk in 3 or 4 word utterances or mini sentences. We're probably expecting that some of them have got limited experience in books, some of them might have more experience in books, and some of them probably could only be able to, at that age, it's likely that 5 minutes of concentration on something which is adult-led, so like a task that we do in a group, is highly likely. They might be able to concentrate for longer when they're playing, but if I sit down and want to do group work, 5 minutes is probably enough. At the end of this marathon that we're getting children to work towards, we want them to be able to read books, whole books containing the first 44 most common letter sound correspondences, and doing an hour of phonics or reading per day by the end of reception. So we need them to be able to concentrate for much, much longer. We need them to know all about how books work. We need them to recognise those letter sound correspondences, but also how to put them together to be able to read. And when we look at what the expectations for children in reception are, so this is when they go to full-time school, the expectations are that they learn these letter sound correspondences, that they learn to blend to read, so put those sounds together to be able to read whole words, and segment to be able to break up words to be able to spell them, and not just be able to read them in just single words, but also to read them in sentences, because when we're reading in books, that's how the words are presented. We are also expected to be in reception children having stories, singing songs, doing rhymes and interacting daily with adults. But there's a bit of a gap here. If we know that the starting line is 3 to 4 word utterances and limited experience in books, and we know that all children that go to reception classes or F2 classes in England need to be starting with the more formal phonics here, what exactly needs to go on in F1 or nursery classes? What should we be doing to help to get our children ready for this so that the finish line is in sight by the end of that reception year? What should it look like? Well, the Development Matters that was published in 2021 gives us some ideas. It talks us about children being able to spot and suggest rhymes, clap and count syllables in words, recognising words by the initial sound or the sound at the beginning, like money and mum, engage in extended conversation, so talk lots and develop new words, because we know that vocabulary is a good indicator of children who are successful in school. Understand that print has meaning. You know that when we see the McDonald's sign, it means that we get a Happy Meal, or that if I've got George in my jumper, it means that that's the shop that maybe it's the label that it's come from. To know that English is read from left to right and top to bottom, and be able to turn pages in a book. That's what we're kind of expecting of 3 to 4 year olds, that they can sing a repertoire of songs, that they know many rhymes off by heart, because that's to do with building their memory. And so much about learning the letter sound correspondence is all about learning to remember. And we need them to be able to pronounce lots and lots of the letter sounds in our spoken language. But it says in their Development Matters really clearly that some children will have trouble saying some particular spoken sounds because of their age and because of their mouth development, and other children have more difficulty with more sounds, but they list a few there that might still be difficult, and that's okay. We expect that 3 to 4 year olds, their mouths are still developing physically, so when they're talking we can understand what they're saying, but sometimes they substitute some spoken sounds just because their mouths aren't particularly developed in that way yet. They might speak in longer sentences, so when at the beginning of the nursery or the preschool year, they might start with 3 or 4 word sentences. We're expecting much longer sentences by the end of once children get to about 4 years old. So if that's the kind of expectation, if that's what the Development Matters is telling us, it still leaves us with kind of questions really. Which words, if we're developing vocabulary, which words do we need to develop? Which stories and songs would be right? Which songs would be right for the beginning of the year? Which stories would be right for the end of the year? What does progression look like in nursery? Because we know that just going by themes is not helpful, because sometimes if we're going by themes and letting the theme say, I don't know, like autumn, there might be a hard book or a longer story or a longer song that we sing in the autumn than maybe one about the seaside that we sing in the summer term. So we need to make sure that we start off progressively more easy and get harder as we go along with the learning, rather than let the topics dictate what we want to be covering. It doesn't mean to say that we can't have topics or we can't link our learning into stories and songs. Indeed, that's good practice, but we've got to make sure that we are making sure that it all links into what the children need to learn, and a really clear development or progression in that learning. We need to know about blending and segmenting. There's no mention of blending and segmenting orally in the development matters for nursery, but we need to make sure that they do need to be able to do it orally, because if the expectation is that they can do it in reading and writing when they get to reception, we've got to start that journey really early. And also, it doesn't talk about GPCs or letter sound correspondences. All that means is, we're not tasked with teaching letter sound correspondences when children are in nursery or preschool. Remember, that starts for everybody on the very first couple of weeks in school. So there is no need for us to rush ahead. We do need to draw children's attention to them, and we can do that in lots and lots of different ways, not least learning to be able to read their names and be able to recognise signs and words in the environment, but we certainly don't want to be teaching them those letter sound correspondences. And it certainly doesn't, in the development matters, tell us where to start. And what we really need, remember, this all comes back to that idea that, learning to read is a marathon, it's not a sprint. We need to know what children's starting points are, and we need to build our provision around that end goal. If we know that in reception, when children start in reception, they need to learn to recognise letters and the sounds that they make, and put them together to make words and blend them together to read words. If that's our end goal, if that's what we need to do by the time children start school, we need in nursery and preschool to prepare them for that, not to rush ahead and do it, not to actually do the marathon. We need to give them all of the tools that build up to that, so that when they start school, it's really easy for them, because we've built all of the bits behind. So it's a bit like, running a marathon. If your training's been right, if you worked on resilience, if you worked on your diet, if you worked on your mindset, if you worked on strength, if you worked on all of those things, then running a marathon is going to be so much easier than just opening the door and expecting somebody to actually be able to achieve it. So we've got to think about this in a strategic way, and here is our roadmap. Now, some of you will recognise some of these pre-reading schools as phase 1 elements, the aspects of phase 1 that were in letters and sounds for years and years and years. And one of the criticisms, and definitely something that I found over time, is the problem with the phase 1 practice, that as it was described in the old letters and sounds phase 1 document, is that it wasn't strategic, there wasn't a plan, it didn't say some things were easier than other things. It was a really good suite of activities, but it didn't, and it did explain how they were helping children to learn, but it didn't really give you a good idea of how to organise your provision so that it was progressive and children could build on it step by step to that end result. What I'm suggesting here is that you think about this more in a progression, that you start with listening and attention, because if the end point is children being able to recognise letters and sounds, to read words from sight, to point to words so that they can read them, to be able to blend words, to be able to read them, cat, segment, to be able to spell them, cat. If that's what our end goal is, we've got to go right back to the beginning and check that they can do all of these pre-reading skills, because it's no good starting with these when all of these other things aren't in place. For example, if I go back a little bit, right back to the beginning, if children can't recognise the difference between the doorbell and a washing machine, familiar sounds that they might hear, then if I say p and b, they're abstract sounds. So I've got to be able to make sure that children can match familiar shapes and objects and actions by the sounds. I've got to check that they can make those sounds, and that they can handle books carefully, so that when we get to the stage of actually being able to do these things in the abstract, the early steps are already in place. Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So if I was running a marathon, I'd at first need to be able to walk to the front door, walk down the street, walk around the block, jog to the front door, jog down the street, jog around the block, before I get anywhere near that whole marathon stage. So the first thing is checking that children can hear and say familiar sounds, make familiar sounds, copy familiar sounds, match some familiar sounds. It could be animal noises, it could be transport noises, it could be musical instruments, or it could be sounds, musical sounds that we make using our own made shakers. It could be anything of that nature. Once children are quite good at being able to do all of those things, then we need to work on their phonological awareness. That's their understanding that, as well as words having a label, being a label for a thing, so a cat is a label for an animal, or jump is a label for an action. When we start to develop their phonological awareness, it's helping them to understand that when we say a word, it's broken up. It's made up of spoken sounds. When we speak, all words are made up of spoken sounds. They're not just labels, fractions, they're sounds in themselves. And this is a really abstract concept, so it's going to take longer for children to develop. Within that, they need to learn kind of like rhythm and beat and movement, because that helps them to understand that words are made up of syllables. Now, obviously, we don't call them syllables when children are in a preschool stage, but we can get them to clap their names. Emma. Easily, because as part of our everyday games, we can also get them to clap words that are familiar to them, like milk or lunchbox or coat. We can do that kind of thing. They don't need to necessarily know the word syllable, but it's training their brain to hear that words are made up of chunks. Beyond that, we can work on rhyme. That's helping the children to see that, again, words can be broken up into chunks, and that they can sound different. So cat, at, at, b, at. The beginnings are all different, but the endings are all the same. So they're hearing whole chunks of words that are similar and parts of words that are different. That's what we're trying to work on with rhyme, to tune children's ears into the chunks of words that might sound similar and that also might sound different. So you can see there that the hearing chunks of words and being able to break words up, moving from just words as labels for objects or actions, is the next key step, really. We're not breaking the words down into their smallest sounds yet. We're breaking them into chunks or into parts, because there's no point in working on tiny little aspects of A for apple or B for ball if they can't hear whole chunks of sound, because all that's going to happen is we'll train them to hear parts of sounds, but then later on it'll all unravel, and so many of the rules to do with spelling, for example, are related to children's understanding of syllables and their ability to rhyme. It makes spelling, for example, so much easier. So the rhyme and the rhythm part is something which some children find really hard, and is something that takes a lot of work, but is fundamental to children's success. So once children can listen and concentrate, match, copy, name, objects, sounds, once they can hear the patterns of language and copy those and match those, and start to be able to hear rhymes in words and be able to match when words rhyme and hear when words don't rhyme, then they're ready to think about the separate sounds in words. And when we think about this phonemic awareness, which is part of their general phonological awareness, when we think about phonemic awareness, there's two bits to it. The first bit will be alliteration. That is, hearing when two words next to each other begin with the same sound. So smelly socks, or slurpy spaghetti, or snuggly slippers, or bouncy ball. So when we're working on alliteration, we're not just thinking of words beginning with a sound, we're thinking about two words together that begin with the same sound. And also this idea of oral blending and segmenting. Once we have got our ears tuned into the fact that two words next to each other can begin with the same sound, and work out that two words might not begin with the sound. So like black cat, they begin with different sounds, so then they don't begin with the same sound. Once we've got that idea in our heads, then and only then are we ready to start with this idea of oral blending and segmenting. The word cat, cat, the word dog, dog, the word hot, hot. So we can start to give the children whole words for them to break up. So if I tell you the word jump, can you break it down into jump? And also me giving them the broken up word cat, and then being able to blend it in their heads. So you can see that this is a learning journey, going through from hearing everyday sounds and saying everyday sounds to being able to hear and say those sounds in words, ready for reading when children start school. So there you have it, what phonics for nursery should look like and why preschool phonics is essential for pre-phonic development. And if you want to get started straight away, this free pre-phonics planning is bursting with new ideas for how to organise and structure phonics for nursery classes and preschool settings, and it's linked in the description below. And now you know how pre-phonics for nursery should look, it's time to get practical. This channel is jam-packed with super simple, easy and fun ideas for phonics for nursery and preschool. There's a Phase 1 phonics playlist full of all the videos you'll need, linked in the description too. And if you've been looking for some reassurance around phonics for nursery and this pre-phonics video has been useful, don't forget to give it a quick thumbs up, subscribe and click the bell to be notified of more videos just like this one. And let us know how you got on. We'd love to hear from you. See you soon.